thank you. It's been a few months since you were on the program.
Yeah, no, good to be back, Glenn, but also good for us to meet in person in Tbilisi last month with so many colleagues from the alternative media. Great fun to meet in person.
Yeah, no, I was saying before we started recording, one gets used to all these digital conferences and interviews. Yeah, it's very different to meet in person. So, yeah, as I said, great to see you again. I did want to talk to you today, though, about this article you recently published, which I'll also put in the description, which is about NATO heading towards war with Russia, or the title is "The Coming War with Russia." So yes, the premise essentially is that, well, what we're seeing now, the European leaders are making a lot of comments about preparing for war with Russia, even setting dates, so stating the intent. They're also developing the capabilities. And again, if you're sitting in Moscow, you're doing a threat assessment, you look at the intentions and capabilities, and a clear threat begins to emerge. And so I was wondering if you can unpack your argument, because it doesn't really seem as if the Europeans are ready for a war with Russia.
Yeah, no, I don't think they are, Glenn. And I think the reason that I wrote the article, because I don't think they have really thought through the potential costs and consequences of such a war. I think what they're essentially thinking is that Russia will sit quietly as they prepare for war, and then in 2030, they'll be ready to go. But before that they can fire as many, or they can provide as many missiles and cruise missiles and drones to attack into Russia with no reaction from Russia. And both of those things go completely against what's being said and heard in Russia. And indeed, even Putin recently said I think it was to new graduates on police and armed forces and things like that Europeans were preparing for a war, and that Russia would too prepare as well. I think what the Europeans fundamentally don't seem to understand, or I should say our European elites, Glenn, the leaders, don't seem to be understand, is that as far as Russia is concerned, this is a defensive war. They are in a defensive posture, and everything that they are doing is to protect themselves from what they see as a NATO expansion and getting closer and closer to the borders, about which they've argued for years and years and years. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us. But the Europeans seem to see it as something of colonial ambition. I mean, I can't think why Russia would want to take over Europe. But more fundamentally, what the European leaders also haven't done is to actually think through what that war would be like. And as I say in the article, the first thing is that there's no guarantee, indeed quite the opposite, that the Russians would wait until 2030. I think it's much more likely that they would respond early. Indeed, I have a strong suspicion, although I can't prove it, that one of the reasons that the Russians went into the Donbass in 2022 was that the general staff had argued that actually the longer they left it, then the more damaging they would, because the more greater forces that they would have to face. So I suspect that was part of Putin's calculation. And I think the same calculation would transpire now. The thing that's most striking, of course, is that the E3, that's Germany, Britain and France, are speaking loudly about the provision of weapons to strike deep into Russia. And the idea that the Russians are going to sit back and just let that happen it's clearly a guess that Russia won't respond. And yet the Russians have said explicitly that actually they have not taken off the table, which means that it's on the table, responses that actually target certain European facilities. And the premise that I had in the article was that actually this war starts sooner than the Europeans plan, because the Russians decide that in the face of European bellicosity, they need to act now to deter future attacks against them. And so the way that I started the article, Glenn, was to suggest that actually Russia does indeed strike, and decides to strike the production facilities in Europe, in particular in Germany, in France, and in Britain, of the places where the drones and the cruise missiles are are being developed to actually then send to Ukraine to attack Russia. My next guess, and it is only a guess, Glenn, I should say it's a scenario. It's not a forecast, but the next guess is that the Europeans invoke Article 5. They then realize that Article 5 doesn't commit people to collective action. It commits them to do whatever they think is best. And I suspect that some nations will not want to go to war with Russia, so they will, provide us with lots of warm words, but no military support. And I think that's particularly likely to be the case, I suspect, for the United States. Not least of all because actually they're now, just suffering from a defeat in Iran and with depleted stock. So I suspect that although they may have pivoted at the G7 towards supporting effects against Russia, that they'll now look at this and say, I'm not so sure this is a good idea. I'm not so sure that extending Russia is a good idea, because it now clearly carries the risk of a land war on the European continent. And the last thing that Americans will want to do is to send American soldiers to fight and die in Europe against Russia. So I suspect that they too will stand back, and suddenly the E3 will find that they're on their own. But my next guess, and it is a guess, is that the E3 then decide to respond nevertheless with air attacks against Russia and find that they suffer from exactly the same problems that the Americans have found in their attacks against Iran, which is that there are very effective air defense systems in place, which are well practiced, the S-400 and S-500, and that as well as actually taking down most of the offensive missiles, they also extract a heavy toll on our aircraft. And that in parallel, because the Russians see that we're attacking them, they then decide to actually take the gloves off and go after our energy infrastructure in exactly the same way that they did in Ukraine. And quick as a flash, on the strait, on the back end of our consequences of self-defeating sanctions on Russia, which have closed off our oil and gas supplies from Russia, and now under the pressure of the Straits of Hormuz reductions in supplies, we suddenly find that Europe is in an energy crisis, which quickly becomes an economic crisis. And so I suspect that the only thing we'll be able to do at that stage is sue for peace, because there are no other offensive options which would work. So that's the nub of the argument, Glenn. And as I say, it is a scenario rather than a forecast. But the purpose of the scenario is to make people realize what the costs and consequences of war could be with Russia. Because I think that there are lots of talk in the West, but particularly in the European capitals, in London, in Berlin and in Paris, about being ready for war. But very few people have thought it through. And had this been thought through and broadcast to the European people, I think people will be much more worried than they currently are. But again, I'd be curious about your view, Glenn, on whether or not European people would be ready for a war with Russia along the lines that I've sketched out.